the question facing Ed Gillespie, the Republican nominee for Virginia governor, right, and Ralph Northam, the Democratic nominee, left, is how to handle President Trump's outsize influence. Steve Helb, Associated Press, Richmond, Virginia. Ed Gillespie, the Republican nominee for Virginia governor, deployed just about every tactical evasion he had learned from a lifetime in politics as he dodged questions about President Trump. Then he finally flashed the irritation. "I don't know the president," Mr. Gillespie said in an interview at his headquarters here when asked whether he thought Mr. Trump was ethical. "I've not met him." If Mr. Gillespie is exasperated with persistent questions about Mr. Trump in the only southern state that the president lost last year, his Democratic opponent in the governor's race has his own problems. He is being whipsawed between his instinctive pragmatism and his party's passion. "Where there's room to work with him, I will. Where he's dangerous, I'll stand up and protect Virginia," said the Democrat. Lt. Gov. Ralph Northam, suggesting he was prepared to do business with a man he spent much of this year calling a narcissistic maniac. By mid-October, the Virginia governor's race every 4 years has typically pierced the consciousness of voters here. State law requires that they pick a new governor each time, and they do so in odd years, free from the distraction of a congressional or presidential campaign on the ballot. Always taking place the year after the White House contests. The state house races here and in New Jersey are often looked to for insights about the mood of the electorate toward the new administration. But Mr. Trump has so overwhelmed a campaign waged by a pair of blunt candidates lacking signature proposals that, much the same way he does across the Potomac, he has made himself and his incendiary style of politics the central issue. "There is so much focus on the activity and the machinations in Washington," said George Allen, the former Republican governor and senator who ran statewide 4 times. "With President Trump, whatever he tweets becomes the news till whatever he tweets next. With the president rampaging through news cycles seemingly every day, the biggest question looming before Mr. Gillespie is whether it is worth the risk of trying to harness Mr. Trump's total eclipse of the sun attention-getting skills to rouse conservative voters." His campaign and the Republican Governors Association signaled to the White House at a meeting this spring that they preferred the reliable hand of Vice President Mike Pence, who campaigned with Mr. Gillespie on Saturday, over Mr. Trump in a state where the president is loathed in the voteric population centers but well-liked in many rural areas. But trailing in every public poll, Mr. Gillespie is now engaged in a robust debate with his advisors about whether he should ask the president to stump with him, according to multiple Republican officials familiar with the conversations. Those in favor of bringing Mr. Trump in for a rally argue that Mr. Gillespie will be linked to Mr. Trump regardless, and, in a state where turnout plummets in non-presidential years, that the president can jolt his supporters who may have been indifferent about the race or uneasy with an establishment-aligned candidates such as Mr. Gillespie, a former George W. Bush advisor and Republican National Committee chairman. But the camp urging Mr. Gillespie to keep his distance from Mr. Trump counters that it would be malpractice to embrace a polarizing president who failed to win even 30% of the vote in Fairfax County, the most populous jurisdiction in the state and once a suburban battleground. As they consider their options, Gillespie supporters have an object lesson: Mr. Trump's ill-fated rally for Senator Luther Strange in Alabama, where he could not resist veering off message. At that rally, Mr. Trump started his feud with the NFL while offering a backhanded endorsement of Mr. Strange's rival, Roy Moore. Mr. Northam once called Mr. Trump a narcissistic maniac, but now says he could work with him. Steve Helb, Associated Press, having watched what a great job he did for Luther Strange, "I'm not sure I do want that," said Ken Cuccinelli, a former state attorney general, suggesting that the president could bring up the bloodshed in Charlottesville with little warning. Trump rallies are about Trump. Then there is the president's calculation: would he even want to risk attaching himself to a potential loser so soon after the Alabama race, in which he felt burned, according to White House officials. West Wing advisors say Mr. Trump is willing to record automated calls for Mr. Gillespie but is not clamoring to fire up Air Force One for the trip to Roanoke. Mr. Trump has tweeted twice about the Virginia race, including on Saturday night when he wrote that Democrats in the southwest part of Virginia have been abandoned by their party, as Mr. Pence was on the way to the region. Yet whether Mr. Trump sets foot here or not, his success at motivating voters with culturally and racially tinged appeals has worn off on Mr. Gillespie. Once one of the loudest voices in his party for an inclusive message, Mr. Gillespie is now assailing Mr. Northam over the Democrats' opposition to a state measure that would have banned sanctuary cities and targeting him for supporting the removal of the state's many Confederate statues. The Republican chafes at questions over whether he is adopting a Trumpian message and foregoing his own advice in 2006 that Republicans should resist the siren song of anti-immigration rhetoric, insisting he is running as who I am and what I believe in. The great thing about a governor's race in Virginia is the people who vote in it are focused on roads and schools and jobs, and the opioid and heroin epidemic, Mr. Gillespie said. But his advertising reflects what he thinks will actually move the electorate. He is spending the bulk of his money on commercials focused on the statues, which make no mention of his view that the South was on the wrong side of history, and illegal immigrants. One of his immigration ads features amply tattooed Salvadoran prisoners meant to be members of the menacing gang MS-13, a target of the president's. Asked if he still supported a pathway to legal status for illegal immigrants, which he once vocally championed, Mr. Gillespie unenthusiastically confirmed that he did, deflating his answer by noting that the debate is 10 years old from my perspective. He did more readily note that he supported accommodating those who were brought here as children illegally, the so-called dreamers. Mr. Northam, for his part, also does not quite seem sure how he should handle Mr. Trump. Appearing earlier this month at a Falls Church shopping center that is a hub for the Vietnamese community, he alluded to bigotry in last year's campaign without mentioning Mr. Trump by name. But his remarks were tame compared to those by the state legislator who introduced him, and called Mr. Trump's election the world's largest nightmare and scorned the president as a draft dodger, after winning his primary partly on the strength of a heavily aired commercial in which he called the president a narcissistic maniac. Mr. Northam, who is running to succeed Virginia's Democratic governor, Terry McAuliffe, used the first debate of the general election to call Mr. Trump a dangerous man who also lies like a rug. But at the final debate last week, held in a pro-Trump enclave of Southwest Virginia, Mr. Northam, who will campaign here this week with former President Barack Obama, made no mention of Mr. Trump. And he has started airing a commercial in which he says to the camera that if Mr. Trump is helping Virginia, it'll work with him. Some Democrats view the ad as counterproductive, rolling their eyes at what they see as a classic case of a campaign overreacting to focus group research. One official confirmed that the spot was the product of comments from participants at a Northern Virginia focus group. It's definitely a change in tone from the primary, said Lowell Feld, a well-read liberal Virginia blogger, while conceding that firing up your base while not turning off others is tricky. But, Mr. Feld added, Trump doesn't make anything easy.